Oh, sorry about that.
Don't worry about it. I'm not watching any of this shit.
I Roderick seems like he wants to, so I feel
Yeah,
bad
it's fine.
because
I mean, yeah,
yeah,
I certainly don't mind
yeah.
it. Okay. I'm going to resist the urge to give context as you got to. Um, I probably shared this in the Discord years ago. I think I wrote this in 2016. It's a long ish poem, uh, but it's pretty straightforward. And so that's kind of going to be a lot of the questions that I have. Where is workshop? There it is. I'm in it already. Sick. Oh, it lost the formatting.
Yes, it will.
As it necessarily would.
You should always take a screenshot. Sometimes what I do.
Oh, smart. But then it's probably harder, actually. Whatever. Fuck it. I'll just do it this way.
Oh, is it? It's pretty long then, right?
It's like 5 stanzas.
No, that's not.
It's like a page. Let me just get the stanzas in there, and then there we go. Okay, getting there. There's no room for anything else. Okay. Ah, there we go.
Oh, cool. Did you want to read it or have
Oh,
someone
sure.
else
Yeah, I
read it?
forgot that we did that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Love song 1. If we're alone forever, does it matter? I'll read slower, actually. I tend to read fast. If we're alone forever, does it matter? If we never find what we're looking for, does it matter? I called you that night because I didn't know what else to do, but I didn't have anything to say, even though I wanted to talk to you. I couldn't say anything. Now here I am, and here you are. Does it mean anything? I'm living somewhere strange. My friends, my family are all far away. I think I did this to be closer to you. At night, I walk for miles, going nowhere. My feet hurt, and I'm covered in sweat. I think I did this to be closer to you. I've emptied myself of everything. I have cigarettes and beer and the sun. I think I did this to be closer to you. I told myself I loved you. Did it matter? You never said the same to me. Did it matter? I don't know where you are. There's only the trace of something you left inside me, a hint of perfume. But I think if I empty myself, that I can make space for this love that has grown inside me. There's not enough room otherwise. There's no room for anything else. I'm living somewhere strange. My friends, my family are all far away. I think I did this to be closer to you. At night, I walk for miles, going nowhere. My feet hurt and I'm covered in sweat. I think I did this to be closer to you. I've emptied myself of everything. I have cigarettes and beer and the sun. I think I did this to be closer to you. Maybe you are somewhere alone thinking of me. Maybe it is better that we only think of one another but never possess each other. Maybe I am more in love with the love I have for you than I am in love with you. I don't know. I don't know anything anymore. I was once something so large and strong. Now I am small and frail. It is only the love I have for you that is large. It is only that love which is still strong.
Cool. Just gonna do a quick one over, which is what I always do. Mm. Cool. Yeah, I can give a general stab at what my impression of the poem was, which is always kind of I kind of like starting there, or a general stab at what the poem was about. My impression was that it's kind of reminiscing over or reflecting on a love lost. That verges into the existential, for lack of a better word, sort of questioning what it means to be in relationship with people at all. And there's something very transient about the descriptions, or what's the way, what am I trying to describe? Fugue state? Do I know what that means? It's not a solid and it's not a liquid. Is basically what I'm trying to say. Because certain sentences, and I like this one. I think if I empty myself, that I can make space for this love that has grown inside me. There is not enough room otherwise. In general, maybe I want to unpack that more. But there's this interesting dance between what it means to relate with other people and how that kind of forms who you are as like a human being, and this strange confusion that comes with it where you don't really have an answer to any of it, especially when when you don't have the person, right? And yet there's such a strong presence still there. You're both empty and full of the love that once was. Yeah. Maybe I am more in love with the love I have for you than I am in love with you. Yeah. I don't know anything anymore, right? I don't know anything anymore. I like these lines. I was once something so large and strong, now I am small and frail. It is only the love I have for you that is large. It is only that love which is still strong. And that's an interesting inversion of how, love is usually a positive thing, but when in this context, it almost reads as if the love is not necessarily a curse, but some kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Towering figure that makes you feel small, right? Makes you feel frail because one, how strong it is, and you don't actually have that person that kind of contains that
Mm-hmm.
energy. I don't know, Roderick. What were your impressions?
So I guess I'll start off with form. So in terms of the form, I actually quite like this format where it's sort of it's a little bit more of a lyrical poetry, where it's sort of I don't know if you did this intentionally, but what I got was sort of broke the poem up into verses and choruses. So we have the chorus living somewhere strange that repeats twice throughout, and which is which gives it a little bit more structure. And then whereas with the verses we have one thought sort of leads to the next. It's very stream of consciousness style poem. In terms of the content, I found it to be very introspective, and my impression was that it's sort of the speaker here is sort of questioning sort of the state of committing to a relationship, right? Because when you're so deeply in love with somebody, your world sort of revolves around them. You see this actually a lot in marriages, whereas if you whereas like people recently divorced, sometimes recount the experience of feeling a complete loss of identity because they themselves, their lives sort of revolved around the other person. So I think the speaker is definitely reflecting on that throughout, particularly with the sort of the sacrifices the speaker makes during the chorus, where it seems that they've sort of abandoned their old way of life in order to sort of be closer to this subject of their affection. But in terms of actually in any opinions on that, I think it's very up in the air, which is the speaker doesn't really force the reader into a particular interpretation. So whether or not this sort of overcommitment, this self-sacrifice is warranted, or is it sort of like a bad thing? Because there are moments where I think you've mentioned this too, Warren, is where the speaker sort of highlights that sort of they're emptying themselves, and sort of particularly with the last verse, which is so large. I was once something so large and strong. Now I'm small and frail. It is only the love I have for you that is large. It is only that love which is still strong. So from that, I sort of got the sense that the speaker is both acknowledging this commitment have done it does come with a lot of downsides, in that the speaker sort of lost their own sense of identity, their own sense of the sort of being confident in yourself, being sort of independent, I guess, is how I read into it, in order to accommodate the the growing love, the deep fondness they have for the subject. But it doesn't necessarily portrays it as a bad thing or a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I got from it. I hope it helps.
Yeah, I want to go back to this line with because it's one that stuck out to me because it's mechanically interesting and kind of throws you for a loop. And I don't know why it throws me for a loop, and in a good way. But I think if I empty myself, that I can make space for this love that has grown inside me. There's not enough room otherwise. There's no room for anything else. So there's this weird. What comes to mind is, if there's not enough room for this love, that means there's kind of a tension between self and other, essentially, we'll just call it that. And then there's this paradoxical relationship where you have to remove yourself from yourself so that there's simultaneously enough space for this love to just be there, which in some way kind of reifies their original identity, right? Because there's almost this, like, there's this attempt to make space for themselves by removing themselves. I don't know. It's an interesting sort of almost Buddhist in a way. Now that I think of it, but yeah, I just thought that was an interesting dynamic.
Also on that line, again, I don't know if it was your intent, but it's actually there's a really clever visual pun there, where sort of the line breaks precisely at "there is not enough room" otherwise. So the sentence breaks off before the line ends, which is it's sort of like a visual representation of there not being enough room, because it's that love has grown so large. I really like that.
I don't remember, but probably not. That's I like that too. Yeah, I don't want to cut you guys off if you had anything else to say, but yeah. So this is the first poem in a cycle I wrote a few years ago that I haven't showed to very many people. At the time, I was probably too close to it. Writing love poetry as one does, it's like pretty exposing of oneself. But the general themes, so it starts off very structured, the whole cycle, and falls apart in structure as it moves on towards despondency. And it is about, it's about love as an experience more than anything. And you said something, Roderick, that I thought was very interesting, which I'm trying to remember, about the proximity of the speaker to the loved one. And it's like, or something like that. And a lot of the poems are about, intentionally, I would say, very much not about the person that the speaker's in love with, but about the love itself, if that makes sense. I'm interested. It sounds like it at least works as a poem, which is important to me. They're all love songs and night songs, right? Love song 1, love song 2, love song 3, Night Song 1, Night Song 2, Night Song 3, and there's a centerpiece that I think is the third poem, which, if we continue to do these, we'll get to eventually. Yeah, I think it's hard because when I was writing these, I was very interested in being able to talk. I have this belief or opinion that a lot of poetry has become very stilted and academic in nature, and so I'm always trying to play with how do we make it more accessible. Obviously, music is a much more popular genre today, and the whole thing is called the Amaranth EP. Amaranth. Actually, there's a couple of interesting things. Amaranta from the Amarantas from 100 Years of Solitude being an inspiration, and the it's interesting that you mentioned even any allusion to Buddhism, Warren, because the perfume line is inspired by a line from a Mishima novel in which he's talking about the presence of the self in material reality as perfume. But yeah, I think that I'm really excited to kind of go through these with you guys. We'll see how far we get. It's an interesting. In some ways, like what I think is the ultimate problem today in poetry is like how do we get anyone to read any amount of poetry? You know what I mean? Right. Like nobody is interested in poetry at all, basically, because it's so. I find a lot of it extremely boring. I read only Agni nowadays, but I used to read a few more of them in the literary journals, and a lot of it's basically the same shit over and over again. And so, how do we make it a little more visceral? And part of the answer that I've come to, for no particular reason, is that it's fear of like being cringy. Effectively, is what is one of the issues, right? And this is a little cringy, right? I think this poem's a little cringy. I think the whole series is a little cringy. And so there's a balancing act to be struck. I guess like if I have any questions for you guys, it's like how cringy is this? And is it too cringy?
To me, I think cringe. Oh, Roderick, please.
Oh, feel free to go first, Warren.
Okay, I'll take you up on that.
Yep.
I have a couple friends who reject the word cringe altogether. They think it's altogether like a toxic word.
It is, certainly, yeah.
Yeah. I think when we're referring to cringe, it's usually a state of vulnerability that has an expectation of acceptance, right? That's what's cringy. When someone comes into a room acting they know everything or something, or share something they think should be accepted, but everyone's kind of like knows the social rules better than they do, and so therefore it's cringy. I didn't think it was cringy, and I thought it was vulnerable. I thought it was an investigation of love, and I did want to say it does come across very clearly that although there is some object of the love, that is removed, and there is an introspection of like, well, there's two people, and then there's this thing between them we call love, but what actually is that, right? It's a collection of utterances that have meaning and interactions, right? It's a good question. What the hell is that thing between them? So that came. That was clear. I think if I got a really intense vibe of, I would use cringe in a poem like this to describe it if it showed a lot of sense of entitlement and resentment towards the object that did not meet its needs, right? Something incel-esque, for lack of a better word.
Sure.
That I would, when I run into that kind of intensity, then I would probably veer, because I still use the word here and there, I would veer towards cringe. But this is just vulnerable. This is just introspection. So not very cringy at
all. I would actually go even further than that. I thought it was a little bit too not cringy, if that's a better word. I don't necessarily mean it in a bad sense. It's just that for me, the speaker is characterized as very impersonal and sort of musing about the nature of relationships in the abstract, in the philosophical sense. I do like that during the chorus part, we do have a little bit of grounding with a lot of more realistic, or would I say more visceral imagery with cigarettes, the beer, and the sun. Um, I think that helps it a little bit, but I don't think that's quite enough. I feel um, this poem it's very well. It's very somber. It doesn't really um, it's not as emotionally resonant as I personally would have liked.
Okay.
I think it's okay to actually get a little bit more personal and be a little bit willing to describe how you feel rather than sort of muse about it more so in the abstract. So that's just my thought on it.
No, I think that
Yeah,
makes a lot of sense, honestly.
if I had to go off of that, now that you mention it, I'm split about it. I think the impersonal nature of the speaker is sort of fitting for this contemplation on what love is, right? Because if it's in between the two objects, so to speak, the two people, um, it's fitting to me that it is abstract. But where I would probably agree with Roderick a bit, and this is something I always forget, and I can't do in my poetry work shit, is that it's physical objects, right? Yeah, physical objects. Maybe that would be. I wouldn't mind more of that. If I think that might help the poem in some ways. If I had to say something, because the moments where you say things, even I'm living somewhere strange. My fans, my friends, my friends, my family are all far away. Even that's like decent in terms of like giving me a context and like a physical location. And then certainly the cigarettes and beer and the sun gives a very distinct image. Um, so yeah, um,
No, I think those both make a lot of sense. I mean, it's. I'm just taking some notes. I think like excuse me. I think in some ways the speaker is abstracted, and like as I said, as we continue through these poems, you'll see kind of what I mean. Um, I don't think that's necessary per se, right? In some ways, that's a useful tool to like, I'm nervous that because so much poetry is so introspective. There's a line to toe, and I'm like not sure where that line is, and so I'm being conservative in some ways. I think, in one direction, that is. Uh, so yeah, I mean, maybe who the speaker is a little not relatable enough. I think that's yeah. I mean, it's really good feedback, honestly. Thank you. Um, and I think that it's in some ways the next poem, whatever we'll talk about it when we get there, is much more descriptive of of physical reality at times. I think that grounding things in the real world and not just in intellect is really important. Actually, to your point, Roderick, uh, and making it not just as you said, the speaker musing about how they feel, but talking about how they feel, describing how they feel, uh, could really help. Yeah,
I,
I
I
fully
did
agree with that.
I did think when you mentioned it's in a cycle of poems, I was thinking like, okay, well, this is a jumping off spot. We'll see how this. I'm imagining that these love songs are, kind of describing some kind of experience, object, or whatever. So this I think is a good jumping off spot, right? In other words, I imagine these love songs are almost supposed to be read one after another.
Yeah, it's like so the three there's love songs, there's night songs,
Mhm.
which I would categorize as more. I don't even
Beautiful,
know how to
dark.
categorize them. Yeah, I don't know. They're more about they're literally about experiences the speaker has at night. I would say,
Right.
um, and tonally are a little bit different, but not that different. And there's this one centerpiece poem, which is the third poem, uh, which is like pretty weird. Uh, and I mean, it's yeah. I mean, we'll see. There are moments later on in the series where it gets very like you know dreaming about a blush on the speaker's cheeks as he imagines his love kissing him,
Hmm.
stuff like that. where it's more physical. But I'll read through it again. I think that this is not the feedback that I expected, which is perfect, honestly. Which is to push it in the direction that I was pushing it even further in some ways. You know what I mean?
Yeah, dope.
Sick. Well, thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Before we stop, I'd just like to go over if there are any lines I like, because that's always something that I think people like to hear. I already said one. I like the repetition. I think I did this to be closer to you. I think that's a nice. It gives the, and there's a couple phrases I repeat, but that kind of sticks out as maybe the most repeated, and it gives it a central. What would you call it? Like rhythm. In an abstract sense, not necessarily in a physical musical sense, but like in terms of an idea, right? That's what's being beat around over and over, amongst others. But yeah. Well, Roderick, if you wanted to share one of your poems,
How much time do we have left?
I have dinner around 6:20, so I have about a little less than an hour, I would say.
And I've got time. I don't have to be to dinner for another hour and a half, hour and 15 minutes.
Okay, because I have a really long one that's 94 lines, so I'm not sure if you guys are in the mood to read something that long, but I have other shorter stuff too.
It's your call. I'd say an hour is probably long enough, but
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah.
Okay. Let me just.
It might be hard as I'm thinking about it. It just might be hard to cover in a way. If it is so long, I can't quite conceptualize how long 93 lines is. But hopefully we can make meaningful bites at it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree, which is like, if we really want to spend a long time talking about it, this might not be perfect, but also I think we could like start it and then talk about it next time if we want to.
Let's not stretch it too long then. I'll post a shorter one.
Good.
That's it. Whew. Just to crop it actually, because I usually write on my iPad, so I have to crop the screenshots just so everything's visible.
I think I've read and that's fine, Roderick. Take your time.
Yep.
I think I've read a Chekhov short story over the. He kind of does like social commentary, right?
He writes very, I would call for us straightforward short stories, but he's writing them in the 1800s, and he's not writing in super flowery prose. He's very good at characterization. I haven't read any of his plays. He's like, I mean, people really revere him for short stories.
About love, fat and thin, a government clerk.
There's one about a poodle. The lady with the dog.
About love.
Okay. It should be in workshop now. Though it's cropped a little bit weird, and I do apologize for that.
Okay.
Okay,
All right.
I'll read it. It's still quite long, but it's short by my standards. Living in fear of dying, when what we want is the most is also what we fear the most. A life well died so worry-free that it didn't need to be, in awe, in fear, in shame, in love. Without loose ends, a tidy resolution to existence's sole dilemma, indeterminate state. Be brave, they say, though it could go either way. Silly thoughts left hanging in the air in subtle pain. They couldn't have known, but of course they could. Then again, it's such a biased parable. Then again, why entertain others in the first place? Your life's your own, conditional, case by case. After all, after the fall, took a leap of faith and drew a crowd when splat like wet paint on the concrete. Videotaped, say the curious, not clickbait. How about a dip, a last resort trip? Painfully suffocate as the mind goes blank, then float away belly up on the bay, seagulls pecking out eyeballs. Got my head stuck in plastic bag like turtles and toddlers. Shot myself with a firearm. Proper handling doesn't go with shaky hands. Jaywalked into an oncoming route. They'll say I'm a weave trying to get isekai'd. Swerved off the cliff and survived, waiting to be eaten alive. Make it look like an accident. Make it quick and clean. That way you'll be worry-free. Don't cause trouble, don't make a scene. A death is not some spectacle to be gawked at. A corpse is not some roadkill you poke with a stick. Everything should be nice and neat. No family with obsequious eulogies, no friends attending because they feel bad about it otherwise. No complications, no failed attempts. No cringy explaining yourself ashamed and not dearly missed, not laughingstock, not another tragedy to move on from, and therefore not some freak incident never to be spoken of. But see, that's how you scare yourself off. That's how they prevent the stray. Of a sheep in the herd, the fly in a web, living in a deadlock, tied up in a dead knot. Keep on wallowing in the melancholy of your own making, and praying to probability that hopefully soon, probably not, that you'll be free. Wishing to have the courage, yearning for an out, waiting for the apocalypse to finish us all off. Until then, it's the quiet suffering of feeling nothing. In our head, all your thoughts, whining, wondering, guilting, excusing, faint ringing, endlessly echoing through the vast empty. The thick, thick atmosphere, the grave gravity. Spinning around and getting pulled down, but never quite reaching the bottom. Left like the last bit of soda in the can, ever so slightly evaporating over the subsequent eons in the landfill. Sleeping pills work thoroughly into your nightly routine, but we always dream of bittersweet. I think we were happy for a while, and somewhere down the line, a thing went wrong. And another, and another, and another, and another. A bad day stretches into a week, a month, a year, the remainder of a life. Or maybe we just made it all up as we went along. Assuredly, it has always been and will always be my fault. And that's okay. Why do people die? Well, I don't know. You just keep walking and walking until you can't anymore. That's how it's always been. Because one day, inevitably, we'll finally be dying without fear of living.
I'm gonna run and grab a lighter. I'll be back in a second.
Hmm.
Okay. See if I can go over here to avoid my parents' eyes. Like,
So I can take a stab at, again, the general gist of what I took away from it. And I think there are certain lines that kind of attempt to sum up the message, but they're a bit cryptic. The first two lines: when what we want the most is also what we fear the most, a life well died so worry-free that it didn't need to be. A life well died so worry-free is a confusing it's cryptic. There are multiple ways I could think of interpreting it. Life well died, so worry free. Um, in general, there's this. Uh, the narrator seems to be commenting on how death is at one moment the thing which defines life and contextualizes it, makes it meaningful at all, right? Um, and it's in that terrifying, and yet there's kind of this cynical jab at the fascination we have with death as a culture, at least as a world. Um, I'm assuming first world countries. I don't know, the internet, things like this, and how it's kind of changed our not appreciation, but just the amount of attention and death we're exposed to, and yet, and maybe I'm projecting here because this is what I notice is that. Um, we're obsessed with it, and yet we'll never actually touch it. We're very terrified of it at the same time. So that's almost like the cynical voice kind of talking about how prevalent death is, and yet we're never how it's everywhere, and it's kind of a joke at some point. Even the last lines, it's like, well, I don't know, death has always been here. It's both casual and again the most dreadful thing possible, and yet it's meaningless. And in some way, this is where I come back to this first line. A life well died, so worry free that it didn't need to be. And that's what we want most is what we fear the most. So it's a life well died without any concern, to the point that it didn't matter that it existed in the first place. So it's almost like insofar as we ignore that death is the thing, in a weird way, if we don't value death or realize how important it is for contextualizing our life, on the one hand, we're worry free, but at the same time, it renders our life meaningless. There's no essential core thing that gives anything meaning. Anyway, sorry, that was a long-winded kind of flailing attempt at getting a gist, but anything, I'm just grabbing at tones of voices and opinions that I picked up.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it was very much about our attitude towards our own death. I don't know if you're done, actually, Warren. I'm sorry if I'm cutting you off.
No, that's all.
And so that line was very much to me about having a complete life, a circular, like what I call, like qualifies as circular life, when that closes itself off. I mean, again, it reminds me of Mishima, who's also obsessed with death and how one dies. Really, like, to start with the first stanza. It's in some ways about, the first stanza at least, is in some ways about having life be, having death qualify life. In the sense that the death is the final moment and the ultimate moment of life, if that makes sense. And so, yeah, I mean, I took this poem generally to be about dying and how one dies, and one's, not just how one dies, but how one thinks about how one should die. And, absent from it, in my first interpretation, at least, in the first reading, is judgment about or analysis of how that plays out in terms of how do we get to how we think about how we should die. Why do we feel the way that we do? Is it even good to have these, opinions? It does make some judgments about that in the first line, right? Which is what we want the most is also what we fear the most, right? To die perfectly, to die in a fulfilling way, either by our own hand, which is, how Mishima would talk about in some ways how this talks about it. It's a lot more playful, this poem, than your other stuff. I mean, all your poems are very playful, right? But this one's very playful, partly because of the rhyming, the intro line rhyming particularly. So it doesn't feel super structured. It feels very like impromptu, which I like. I like structure in general. and playing with structure, as I've said before. And I think that it's quite successful here. And it's not just the rhyming, actually, now that I think about it. The language as well. How about a dip, a last resort trip? Again, there's rhyming there, but the, truncated, how about. And so that tone, combined with the subject matter, I think gives us some insight into how the speaker feels about all of this, and maybe gives the most critical. I mean, the thing that's interesting to me, right, is the criticism of, and I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean the criticism of our attitudes. Oh, my computer's going to die in a second. I should finish the cigarette. The criticism about our own desire to die in a certain way, and for me, the way the reader is, the speaker is talking about it is as something that we are too self-serious about, if that makes sense. And these last lines in the last full stanza, or maybe we just made it all up as we went along. Assuringly, it has always been and always will be my fault. I think that's the only time. Oh no, I guess there's a couple other mentions of I or whatever. This personalizing of it. That was a line that confused me, actually. Assuringly, it has always been and always will be my fault. I can't tell if it's referring to something that the interlocutor is experiencing, or if they're talking purely about their own experience of, and maybe this is more accurate, judging their own death and judging how they want to die and all that shit. In a lot of ways, this is a more straightforward poem than your other poems, I think. The subject matter comes through quite clearly. Yeah, I mean it's similar stylistically to your other poems, but it's quite different in a lot of ways, and I found that very interesting. Let me run in real quick. I had one question about this punctuation that you have, such as in the line "whining, wondering, guilting, excusing." I haven't seen that punctuation before. Is that
Uh,
a theme?
oh yeah. I don't know if it's found in English actually, but sort of because my native language is Chinese, so we sort
Yeah,
of Chinese technically Japanese uses this punctuation too, but it's a little bit different. It's this punctuation is just it's meant to be it's shorter than a comma.
I see.
Yeah. So a brief pause, sort of,
Cool.
before going on to the
I
next.
like that.
Yeah, like generally, like it's a short comment that you would see when you're listing things off or stuff. So it's a little bit briefer than the full pause, technically a half pause, demanded by a comma.
Cool. Yeah, I mean I like punctuation as well. As a way to exactly do that, right? Determine how long the reader is pausing. I do wonder if, due to unfamiliar, I mean, I think the way you read it actually is how I would read it: whining, wondering, guilting, excusing, with less of a pause than you'd have with a comma. I think it does work, even though it's unfamiliar. Yeah, I mean, I'm interested a lot in. So one of the things that I think a lot about is what can be cut away. Um, and I'm interested in hearing from your perspective: is the length intentional? Is it necessary? And what parts of it? Because like in the first picture, right, there's a lot of talk about suicide. How much of that needs to be there? I don't really have an answer, and how much of it is superfluous or repetitive in a way that, I mean, the repetition is obviously the point, and so does that repetition contribute? I don't know. Honestly, I'm not totally sure. Um,
To me, it seems like there's. I'm trying to think about how this poem, because it's talking about death. It's talking about their death. It also seems like they're talking about how death is perceived and works as an idea in like the collective consciousness. That's where I see this repetition of different ways to die, um, and then these cynical descriptors: videotape to sate the curious, not clickbait. About it. How about a dip, a last resort trip? Um, uh, the line about being a weeb, for example, right? So there's definitely there's this weird. I saw those lines as kind of getting at the kind of tension between how we see our own life versus how we kind of treat death in general. And so that does lend the poem to this comical, absurdist, maybe fatalistic in a optimistic sense, um, in terms of how you approach death. Like even the last few lines before you do this, before it kind of goes into this question, which I agree was the first time the speaker felt like a person, really, as opposed to kind of a social critic, kind of floating in the ether. Assuringly, it has always been and always will be my fault, and that's okay. So the my fault did also take me um, um, by surprise, because then suddenly the narrator is a person, and I immediately imagined a scenario in which, amongst all this kind of candid, lighthearted, but cynical at the same time depictions of life and death, um, maybe even questioning the meaning of any of it, suddenly it's someone's fault, right? Suddenly someone's to blame. Suddenly there's something of value here. And it's like important, right? It's my fault. And that, I think, saying something my fault is loaded with all sorts of connections with other people, with identity, so on and so forth. That implies a meaning. And then, the dot, dot, dot's very cute, right? Because it's kind of like, this is a serious statement. It's my fault. You say it into the darkness right before you die, and then it's like, oh, and that's okay. And so again, it just snaps right back to like, whatever. But after that, I do think there's this strange weight that actually isn't present throughout the poem. And so I'm kind of rambling now, but I like that part. It humanized the poem more than all the cynicism and frankness before. And in that way, it's almost mostly it's well, maybe not more disturbing than seagulls picking out eyes, but it was disturbing in a way. It hit. Um, yeah. But in terms of cutting, I would think like what I would ask myself would be like, well, what major idea am I getting? Am I thinking about death? I don't know if any of this is relevant. Maybe there's something else going on in this poem completely. But um, am I thinking about death as I relate to it? Am I commenting on death as society views it and treats it, kind of this impersonalized entertainment standpoint? Or am I talking about the weird intersection of both those things, which is what I'm taking this poem to be? Um, and maybe a little bit of a lie, um, in terms of the candid lightheartedness, right? I'm almost skeptical of that position being as true as it's trying to portray itself here. Maybe because of that, my fault. But yeah.
I do think, talking about cutting, there are lines here and there. I'm thinking in the second image, keep on wallowing in the melancholy of our own making, which aren't like I didn't find that line particularly contributory.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas like living in a deadlock, tied up in a dead knot of a sheep in the herd, the fly in a web, praying to probability that hopefully soon, probably not, that you'll be free. The lines around it kind of accomplish much better, I think. It's a very straightforward line, which I like straightforward things. A lot of the time, I'm not always reading poetry that is requiring a ton of interpretation. But here, I think this poem has a lot of strength in saying things obscurely, like not directly and whatever. Though it's not a tremendously obscure poem in general.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Trimming, right? Not looking to cut out big sections, but looking for these sentences that
Yeah.
don't quite function. Yeah.
What is a Ute?
So again, if you don't know already, DZ, but why don't you probably know, that all the little pieces that I wrote are all part of like a larger story. So these are supposed to be authored by various characters sort of in my whip. And sort of, it's basically a novel that's going to consist of little pieces of media bits and there. So you might get dialogue transcription, you might get a chain of emails or texts, you might get a few photographs, or you might get like a poem or a short story that's written by the characters.
No, I know.
So with being that the character who write this is Australian, and I believe in Australian English instead of a truck is a woot. Sort of like how they're called worries in British English.
I see. Cool.
If we still have time, I'd like to ask a few questions before I sort of put back the curtain a little bit and explain my thought process behind it. How did you feel about the conversation bit? Because there's a clipping, so right near the end, you get a clipping of an actual dialogue that breaks the poem entirely.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to say without the context, is what I would say. It certainly in itself doesn't seem to accomplish too much, except to establish the relationship between the two speakers and their character. And so without knowing who they are and what the relationship is, it's hard to say.
I do think I didn't mind it. I don't think it added too much, and I think that's because maybe because of the length. There's so much already going on. I don't know. I don't know how I feel about it. I like the idea of it. I'm imagining it in a whip where I might actually understand who these people are, right, very distinctly, right? It might refer to earlier in the novel, or maybe two characters who you don't actually see have this conversation happen, but you totally know who they are. Then I think it would work very well. I like the idea of it. I don't know how I feel about it as it is right now. That's not much help. The image that comes to mind, though, when I read it is introspective, younger person. Why do people die? And then this kind of like down salt of the earth, maybe not the brightest person in the world. Honest answer, I don't know. You just keep walking and walking until you can't anymore, and that's how it's always been. And kind of as someone who's now an adult, obviously that's both like a really good answer and also a really bad answer, right? So yeah.
Okay. Which one did you feel with the speaker?
Oh, interesting.
Wait, what was it?
Which of the two?
Yep.
Oh,
it's a question
interesting.
and a reply. So who do you think the speaker was the one who asked the question, or the speaker was the one who?
Yeah, the one who asked the question is what I would assume is the. Though honestly, it could be either. We don't get much of the first speaker, but like they come off as more self-serious than the latter, and the poem is quite humorous. But then again, we really don't get much of the first speaker, so I'm guessing the first, but I'm not sure.
I would also say the first. I imagine this as just intuitively, a dialogue from the past. And this kind of conversation is one of these first moments where the narrator comes in contact with the kind of absurdity of death itself, right? And so basically it's like retrospective, right? All of this, everything that came before it is kind of the reflections that happened after the dialogue as the person got older. And at this moment, it's kind of throwing in this flashback. So I would say the first is as I read it, that's how it came off. I also think the kind of candid, almost like puzzled response of the second person, like, I don't know, you just keep walking till you can't anymore. That's how it's always been, is something that is a little, it doesn't fit the tone of the rest of the poem. Like the poem has put a lot of thought into death. This speaker doesn't really think, it doesn't come across as they put a lot of thought about it into it.
Yeah. And then I sort of this is more of a guiding question, but how did you interpret the but see? That's how you scatter yourself off. That's how they prevent the stray of a sheep in the herd, the fly in a web.
Which oh, it's in the end. Yeah,
Second
yeah.
image.
Second image.
Yep.
Yeah. I took it as they convincing themselves not to kill themselves. That's how you scare yourself off from killing yourself. That's how they prevent suicide. Someone who's trapped in an untenable situation from killing themselves.
And do you think is it do you feel that the, is sort of the speaker just trying to trying to make light of the topic in a more abstracted way, or is it sort of is the speaker sort of being candid here,
Both.
being that's how they feel?
Both, I would say.
Okay. Okay, and then I wanted to ask about, I think, well, we were happy for a while, and somewhere down the line, a thing went wrong, and another, and another, and another, and another. A bad day stretches into a week, a month, a year, the remainder of a life. So that part, do you think that the speaker, do you think, what do you make of that line?
I instantly think of it as, frankly, my first response was like, well, that's a cognitive distortion, probably. Other than that, someone coming from a bad place.
And do you think that's the speaker making up a story in the position of the reader, or is it sort of by that I mean sort of creating a backstory for the reader in order to sort of loop them in a little bit, or is it the speaker speaking from again personal experience?
Yeah, I would say it's both. I read it. I read it as both a creation of a backstory for the narrator, and I maybe this isn't helpful, but also just a characterization of how everyone experiences this. Right, this is
Yeah.
the narrative that everyone kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree completely, and kind of as a projection, right? Like this is something maybe that the reader has experienced or the speaker has experienced a little bit, and so they're kind of projecting it onto human. Like when they say we, they mean everybody. One always dreams of bitter. Like you could exchange one we for one, basically there.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. This has been really helpful. Do you have any specific feedback for me, or do you have any questions that were posed that you felt were a little bit confusing and would like a little bit? Because a lot of these pieces, they do work better with context, even though they are sort of kind of meant to stand alone.
Yeah, I mean the only feedback I would give is look for places to cut, because I think that
Yeah.
like there are probably lines here and there, and maybe I don't really a full stanza doesn't come to mind, or not even a full like semantic region within a stanza, but um, it does feel longer than it needs to be in some ways, and so I wonder how it can be made more concise. Like I think a lot of obviously the effects and the impact on the reader would be quite different, but I do think you could communicate a lot of the intellectual message, if that makes sense, in very few lines. And so the question is like, okay, so the length of the poem is serving some other purpose than to communicate exclusively some thought. What is that purpose, and is our particular parts in it achieving that purpose?
I would only add that there are. It depends on your audience, but so the final line, dying without fear of living, are the last two, because one day inevitably we'll finally be dying without fear of living, with the title being living in fear of dying. There is a message there that it took me a while to puzzle out, and I'm not sure if it's correct. So two things. One, that comes off very confusing, just in general, very cryptic, like it's a puzzle. And then two, I can give you my interpretation so you know how someone who sat down right now and actually tried to puzzle it out interprets it. And then you can choose whether or not you think it functions in the way that you wanted it to. So dying without fear of living would position, again, it's sort of paradoxical because you're dying. Okay, so you imagine someone commits suicide because of a fear of living. Living is too painful. So in the moment that you're dying, but you no longer have the fear of living, it would beckon the question, well, why are you dying, right, if you're committing suicide? So that's how I interpret it. And then my mind kind of jumps to the symbolic interpretation that something like, for lack of a better word, an ego death, right? You are dying in a sense, with no longer with this fear of experiencing the pain that goes with that, the grief, whatever. You're willing to live life out by this sort of symbolic dying. That is my stab at it. I don't know if that came close to what you wanted, so maybe keep that in mind. I don't know, Sleazy, if you have a different interpretation or made anything of it.
No.
Oh, I actually forgot to ask this, so I'm sorry for keeping you too long. But Steely, you asked this question about your piece earlier, and I'm going to ask the same question again. Do you think that it's cringy?
It's a good question.
Because I
Yes,
was writing
in,
it,
in a
I
limited
felt, yeah.
in a limited sense. The speaker feels cringy, but the poet doesn't, if that makes sense, right? In other words, talking about suicide's hard. The speaker feels a little self pitying, but not that self pitying because they're facetious about it, which one often is. Um, if that makes sense, like I don't think the poem itself is really cringy in a bad way at all, but the speaker is a little like not someone I would necessarily want to spend too much time with, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that was great. This guy seems miserable and very cynical, and I think there are moments of this that exist in everybody. But if it is a whole personality,
Yeah,
then check. Right, I'm not interested.
yeah, exactly.
And what, and I'm assuming, did you think that the humor helped with it, or it doesn't?
Oh, I love the
uh,
humor.
I think the humor is good. I think that's a strong point. I mean, you can't. I think that's ultimately sort of something we all need to take up with death is something like a absurdist humor about it. So I like that. I think that's the speaker's charming point.
Yeah,
Um, is his cynical humor.
and not just that, but it gives us personality, right?
Right, right.
It gives us the personality of the speaker much more than a purely somber reflection on death would.
So, would it be correct to say that both of you felt as though the humor actually, rather than detracting from the emotionality of the poem, it actually helped personalize it a little bit, make it
Yes,
a little bit more visceral and
absolutely.
resonant? Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much. That's pretty much everything I wanted to ask about it. Yep.
Great,
Great.
awesome.
Oh, right. Warren. Oh, this might be a long shot, but since you've read all the pieces I've submitted so far, which does the stylistically, does it remind you of anyone in particular, or does it feel sort of stylistically I identityless, or does it feel sort of have a very distinct tone that makes it separate from the other ones?
I would say I wanted to say I think in some ways this poem does strike out. And it's well, I don't know. I will say the most common thing amongst your poems is that the poems sound like they're being written by someone who's intelligent. And sometimes, especially when you're the one reading it to me over and over, and I don't have the context, that can make it seem like the voice is very similar. That said, none of your other poems have mentioned dying as a weeb. So that helped in creating a sense of a different personality and defo and slang like this. So I would say but no family with obsquicious, I can't even pronounce it, eulogies. Like that is a word I would never use. That seems like it's not too obscure of diction, but it's obscure enough to be like, oh, this person's probably pretty smart if they're ever using that word. I know that's like what I say every time, but yeah.
Yeah. And Sleazy, on that front, do you have any thoughts regarding it as well? I know you've read two of the other pieces I've submitted, so trying to,
Yeah.
yeah, it's tough to recall. Probably.
No, I thought it was totally quite distinct.
Yeah.
The other two were on similar subjects, technology and its juxtaposition, or modernity, or whatever, and its juxtaposition with the natural world or beauty or what have you. And so this one felt quite distinct.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
I will say I'm getting an idea that your whip is concentrating on this kind of common theme of social malaise with modernity and other existential themes. But again,
Yep.
a little bit of global warming comes up, and this kind of strange isolation from the environment or others is also a major theme that I'm noticing. So if you're attempting to do that, then that's working. Cool. Well,
Thanks.
awesome. Thank you so much for showing up, guys. This was awesome. I will be hosting it again next week, and I'm sorry. I will try to get those. I will get one up tonight. I promise. The earliest one or the latest one. I mean.
No pressure.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, because I personally, I don't really like taking notes in real time, so I much prefer to listen to a VOD or like a playback and then take notes from there.
You're
Yeah.
serious? Yeah, I like it. Great. Well, I'm probably gonna have dinner. Have a good night, guys. Rest up. Don't kill yourself. Life's good.
You as well.
It's just painful a lot. That's okay. Yeah. Cool.
All right.